What if the people meant to protect us were the ones pulling the strings? A dedicated nurse, a corrupt cop, and a system built to silence the truth. Maya Brooks never wanted to be a hero. But when she stood up for what was right, they took everything from her, her job, her name, even her freedom. Now, she has one last chance. Expose them, or disappear forever. But the real question is, can you ever truly bring down a system designed to bury you? The fluorescent lights of St. Vincent Hospital buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the emergency room. Maya Brooks tightened the stethoscope around her neck as she hurried through the hallway, her sneakers barely making a sound against the polished linoleum floor. It was supposed to be an ordinary night shift, the kind she had done countless times before. But the tension in the air told her otherwise. A trauma case was inbound. A car accident victim in critical condition. The paramedics had called ahead, their voices strained over the dispatch radio. Internal bleeding, possible head trauma, no time to waste. Maya pushed through the double doors leading to the ambulance bay, expecting to see the stretcher being rushed inside. Instead, she found herself face to face with a uniformed figure blocking the entrance. Jake Rollins stood with his legs slightly apart, arms crossed over his chest, a look of quiet authority settling on his face. The kind of stance that said he wasn't moving for anyone. The name tag on his dark uniform glinted under the hospital lights. Maya barely slowed down. "Officer, I need to get through." Rollins didn't budge. "Restricted area. Step back." Confusion flickered across her face. "This is the emergency entrance," she said, her breath short. "A trauma patient is on the way in. I have to be there." Rollins tilted his head slightly. "Security protocol. You'll have to wait." The explanation didn't make sense. Maya glanced past him, catching a glimpse of an ambulance just pulling in, its lights flashing against the glass. Inside, she saw paramedics moving frantically, their hands working over a limp body. Her stomach clenched. Every second counted. "This is insane," she said, trying to move around him. "That patient." Rollins extended an arm, firm but not aggressive. "Step back." A flicker of anger flared inside her. "If you don't let me through, that person might die." Rollins remained unmoved. His expression was unreadable, but there was something deliberate about the way he held his ground. He wasn't just following orders. He was choosing to stand in her way. A voice called from behind. "Maya." Dr. Patel, the attending physician on shift, jogged toward them, his face twisted with urgency. He was already pulling gloves onto his hands. "What's the holdup?" "She's not authorized to enter," Rollins said evenly. Dr. Patel frowned. "She's a trauma nurse. She doesn't need authorization. Move." For a moment, the air between them thickened, the quiet hum of sirens outside pressing against the silence. Rollins didn't step aside, not immediately. Then, just as Dr. Patel was about to push past him, Rollins exhaled through his nose and took one slow step back. It was a small movement, but the way he did it made it clear, it wasn't because they had the right to be there. It was because he had decided to let them through. Maya didn't waste another second. She bolted forward, pushing through the doors as the paramedics wheeled the gurney in. But as soon as she laid eyes on the patient, her heart plummeted. The man on the stretcher, mid-50s, blood pooling beneath him, wasn't stable. His breathing was erratic, his pulse weak, his eyes flickered open for a second, then rolled back, BP's dropping fast. One of the paramedics shouted, "Get him to Trauma 1. Dr. Patel ordered. Maya reached for the IV line, her hands moving on autopilot, years of training taking over. But something about the way her fingers trembled told her she was still rattled. Seconds. That was all they had. She heard the monitors beep wildly, an erratic rhythm that signaled the body's desperate fight for survival. The team moved around her, voices overlapping, orders being given, and then, just as she reached for the crash cart, the beeping flatlined. Maya froze. The voice came from the other side of the gurney, sharp and urgent. "We're losing him." For the first time that night, fear pierced through her frustration. Because deep down, she knew, if she had gotten to him sooner, if there hadn't been a delay at that door. She clenched her jaw, her pulse roaring in her ears. Somewhere outside, beyond the hospital walls, Rollins still stood at his post. Maya Brooks walked through the hospital hallway, her hands still cold despite the warmth of the air inside. The weight of what had happened in the trauma bay clung to her like a damp coat. She should have been focused on her next patient, on the routine of saving lives. But her mind was stuck on the image of the man on the gurney. The jagged sound of the flatline ringing in her ears. She should have been able to reach him sooner. She reached for her ID badge out of habit as she approached the break room door. Swiping it against the access panel, the light blinked red. Frowning, she tried again. Red. Her stomach dropped. She pressed her badge against the scanner a third time. A little harder now, as if force alone could fix whatever glitch was happening. The same dull beep. Maya? She turned to see Lisa, one of the senior nurses, approaching with a clipboard in hand. Lisa hesitated when she saw the look on Maya's face. Something wrong? My badge isn't working, Maya said, forcing her voice to stay even. I think there's an issue with the system. Lisa hesitated, then gave her a careful look. You should check with administration. That was the first sign that something was wrong. Lisa had worked at St. Vincent's for over a decade. She wasn't the type to get nervous over a technical issue. Maya didn't wait. She turned on her heel and headed straight to the administrative office. The receptionist, a woman named Diane, barely looked up when Maya approached the counter. My ID isn't working, Maya said. I can't access the emergency department. Diane pursed her lips. You'll need to speak with HR. A cold sensation settled in Maya's chest. Why would I need to? They asked to see you. Diane kept her eyes on her computer screen. They're expecting you now. Maya's pulse quickened. She turned and walked toward the HR office. The sounds of the hospital fading into the background. Inside, the office smelled like stale coffee and old paperwork. A middle-aged man in a stiff white shirt sat behind the desk. His hands folded. Ms. Brooks, he said, offering a tight smile. Please, have a seat. She didn't move. Why is my badge deactivated? He exhaled as if he'd been expecting the question. There's been a report filed against you. Maya's stomach clenched. A report? A claim of disruptive behavior. Hospital policy requires us to investigate. She stared at him, trying to process his words. Disruptive behavior. That was what they were calling it. Not the fact that a patient had been delayed life-saving treatment because a cop decided to flex his authority? This is a mistake, she said, her voice steady. I understand, the man said, his smile still in place. But until the investigation is completed, your access will remain restricted. Maya felt her nails dig into her palms. She knew exactly what this was. This wasn't an investigation. This was retaliation. And she knew exactly who was behind it. She turned and walked out of the office without another word. Her heart pounded as she made her way back to the ER. She needed answers. And she knew where to get them. Jake Rollins was standing at his post near the ambulance bay, looking as relaxed as ever. Maya walked straight up to him. What did you do? Rollins didn't even look surprised. He just smiled, that slow, knowing smirk that made her skin crawl. I don't know what you mean, he said. My badge is deactivated. HR is investigating me. That's not a coincidence. Rollins exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. You really don't get it, do you? Maya narrowed her eyes. This isn't about your badge, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. It's about knowing your place. Maya felt her fingers curl into fists. You delayed treatment for a dying man. And now you're punishing me for calling you out? Rollins chuckled. Punishing? No. Teaching a lesson. Maya's breath came sharp and fast. But she forced herself to stay still. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her lose control. You're making a mistake, she said. Rollins tilted his head, studying her like she was a particularly dull student. Then, without warning, he reached into his pocket and pulled something out. Her ID badge. Maya's stomach twisted. You want this back? Rollins asked, holding it between two fingers. Maya didn't move. Rollins smirked, and then, slowly, he let the badge slip from his fingers. It hit the ground between them with a soft clatter. Maya stared at it. She could feel the eyes of the people around her. Other nurses, a couple of orderlies, a few techs. None of them spoke. None of them moved. Rollins took a step back, folding his arms again. Be smart, Brooks, he said. You don't want to make this worse for yourself. Maya didn't look at him. She bent down, picked up the badge, and dusted it off. When she straightened, her hands were steady. Rollins expected her to break. Instead, she lifted her chin, met his gaze, and let him see exactly what he had just created. Maya sat in the hospital parking lot, her fingers drumming against the steering wheel. The ID badge in her lap felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried the weight of something far greater than plastic and ink. She had spent the past 10 minutes staring at it, turning it over in her hands, searching for some kind of answer. It wasn't just a piece of identification. It was a key. One that had been taken from her in front of her peers, reduced to nothing more than an object of humiliation. And now, even though she had picked it up, she knew it no longer unlocked anything. The hospital had made its choice, and it wasn't her. She inhaled sharply, forcing herself out of the car. The night air was crisp, laced with the faint scent of rain. But she barely noticed. She had spent years at St. Vincent's, building a reputation, earning the respect of her colleagues. Now, with one calculated move, all of that had been stripped away. Inside, she walked past the reception desk, expecting resistance, but the clerk barely looked up. That was almost worse. It meant they all knew. Maya took the elevator up to the administrative floor, where the HR office was tucked away in a quiet corner. When she stepped inside, Diane, the same receptionist who had directed her earlier, lifted her head. "You're back," Diane said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. "I need to speak with someone about my ID," Maya said, keeping her voice steady. Diane hesitated before glancing at her computer screen. "You should probably wait in the lounge. Someone will call you." "I'd rather not wait." Diane gave her a careful look. "Maya." The door to the main office opened before she could finish. The same HR manager from before stepped out, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Brooks, come in." Maya followed him into the small, windowless room. A single folder sat on the desk between them, thick with documents. "You're under an internal review," he said, adjusting his tie. "For what?" "For disruptive behavior and insubordination." The words barely registered. She leaned forward. "Because I tried to do my job?" He sighed, flipping open the folder. "A formal complaint has been filed against you, citing multiple incidents where you allegedly created a hostile work environment and failed to comply with hospital security protocols." "That's ridiculous. I understand this is a lot to take in," he continued, his tone measured. "But until the investigation is complete, your access to the ER will remain restricted." Maya clenched her jaw. "You know this is retaliation." He didn't deny it. He just closed the folder and folded his hands. "You should consider taking some time off," he said. "Let things settle." Maya stood so abruptly that the chair scraped against the floor. "Let things settle?" She let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. "A man died because I was kept out of the trauma bay. And now I'm the one being investigated?" His silence was answer enough. She left without another word, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. As she made her way down the hallway, her phone vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out, expecting another message from a colleague, maybe even someone offering quiet support. But the email on her screen stopped her mid-step. No subject line, no sender name, just an attachment. She hesitated before opening it. Inside was a document, her personnel file, or at least, what looked like it, but it wasn't the same one she had signed when she first started at St. Vincent's. This one had additions, false reports, complaints she had never seen before, accusations that made her stomach twist. And at the bottom, stamped in bold, official ink, was the hospital's seal. The conference room was colder than Maya remembered. The air conditioning hummed softly, a contrast to the tension that clung to the walls. A long, polished table stretched down the middle of the room, lined with leather chairs. Most of them were filled. She stood in the doorway for a brief second, scanning the faces of those present. Board members, administrators, legal representatives. Some she recognized, others were strangers. At the far end of the table sat Charles Whitaker, the hospital's chief of operations. He barely acknowledged her before gesturing to an empty chair. "Ms. Brooks," he said, his voice formal, detached. "Have a seat." Maya hesitated but moved forward, pulling out the chair with slow deliberation. The moment she sat, she noticed them, the files, thick folders stacked neatly in front of the board members, all bearing her name. Her chest tightened. This wasn't a meeting. This was an ambush. Whitaker cleared his throat. We are here to discuss recent concerns regarding your conduct. Specifically, allegations that have come to light regarding multiple incidents of insubordination and behavior unbecoming of a St. Vincent's employee. Maya folded her hands in her lap, forcing herself to remain calm. This is about what happened in the Whitaker barely reacted. This is about a pattern of behavior that has raised concerns. She exhaled slowly. I need to understand exactly what I'm being accused of. One of the board members, an older woman with reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, flipped open a folder. She scanned the page before speaking. There have been complaints of disruptive behavior, disregard for hospital security measures, and, most recently, unprofessional conduct toward a law enforcement officer. Maya sat very still. Law enforcement officer? Whitaker adjusted his tie. Officer Jake Rollins has filed an official report regarding your actions during the incident in the A cold sensation spread through her limbs. Of course, Rollins wouldn't need to be here in person. His words were already sitting in front of them, printed neatly in black ink. I see, she said evenly. And has anyone considered my side of the story? Silence. She scanned the room. Do you all really believe I was the one disrupting patient care that night? Because from where I was standing, it wasn't me blocking the trauma entrance. One of the administrators, a man in a dark gray suit, sighed. Ms. Brooks, we understand that the situation was difficult, but arguing with a law enforcement officer in a high-pressure environment. That's not what happened. She cut in. I wasn't arguing. I was trying to save a patient's life. Whitaker leaned forward slightly. And yet, Officer Rollins described your behavior as aggressive and incooperative. Maya let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Aggressive? Incooperative? I was locked out of my own while a man was dying on the other side of the door. More silence. She pressed her palms against the table. I know what this is. You're protecting him. She turned her gaze directly to Whitaker. You're protecting them. A flicker of something crossed his face, but it was gone before she could identify it. We are simply following protocol, he said. Protocol, she repeated. Whitaker exhaled, as if suddenly tired of the conversation. Your employment status is under review. Effective immediately. You are suspended from duty pending the outcome of this investigation. Maya stiffened. Suspended? The older woman with the glasses slid a sheet of paper across the table. You may review the terms here. She didn't touch it. Whitaker continued, his voice smooth and final. Until further notice, you are not to enter the emergency department or engage in any professional activities within this hospital. Maya stared at the paper, her pulse a steady thud in her ears. And then, just as she was about to reach for it, something caught her attention. A blank space. A single missing detail in the documentation. The security footage, she said suddenly. The board members exchanged brief glances. She sat back. You have security cameras all over the There should be footage of that night. Whitaker hesitated. Maya narrowed her eyes. You already checked, didn't you? Silence. Then, after a long pause, Whitaker spoke. There was an issue with the recordings from that evening, he said. Her stomach dropped. An issue, she repeated. A system malfunction. Another administrator chimed in. Unfortunately, the footage from that night is unavailable. Maya let out a slow breath. They erased it. Of course they did. For a long moment, she just sat there, staring at the table. Then she reached out, took the paper, and folded it in half. She stood up. Without a word, she turned and walked toward the door. Her hands were steady, but inside, everything was burning. When she stepped into the hallway, she reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone. She needed to think. She needed to. The screen lit up with a new message. No name, just a number she didn't recognize. She tapped it open. A single line of text stared back at her. I have something for you, but I can't hold onto it for long. Maya's fingers tightened around the phone. She read the message again. Then she turned and walked faster. Maya sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel as she read the message again. The words felt like a spark in the darkness. A small sliver of hope buried under layers of frustration and fear. She had spent the last few hours pacing her apartment, trying to piece together everything that had happened. The suspension, the fabricated report, The missing security footage. It wasn't just about her anymore. It never was. If someone had proof, she needed to see it. Her fingers hovered over the screen before she finally typed out a reply. Where? A response came almost immediately. Corner of Pine and 12th. 30 minutes. Come alone. Maya hesitated, then dropped the phone onto the passenger seat. Her gut told her it was a risk. But what other choice did she have? She turned the key in the ignition and pulled out of the lot. Merging onto the quiet streets of Atlanta. The meeting spot was a gas station. One of those old, rundown ones with a single flickering light above the pumps. The convenience store attached to it was dark. The metal shutters pulled halfway down. Maya parked near the edge of the lot, scanning her surroundings. There were no other cars except for an old sedan parked near the side of the building. Then she saw them. A man in a hooded sweatshirt, standing near the payphone. He was shifting from foot to foot, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds. Maya stepped out of her car but didn't move closer. You're the one who messaged me? She called. The man hesitated, then nodded. She took a step forward. Who are you? He exhaled shakily. It doesn't matter. His voice was hoarse, like he had been talking in whispers for too long. What matters is what I have. Maya glanced around, her skin prickling. What do you mean? The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a flash drive. This, he said, it's proof. Maya's breath hitched. She stepped closer, her heart hammering. Proof of what? He swallowed hard. Rollins. He's done this before. Maya felt a chill crawl down her spine. The man took another unsteady breath. A few months ago, there was a patient, young black guy, early 20s, brought in with a gunshot wound. He was alive when he got here. His voice dropped lower, and then Rollins showed up. Maya's stomach twisted. He went into the trauma room alone. The man continued. 15 minutes later, the kid was dead. Maya felt the air grow thick around her. What happened? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man shook his head. I don't know, but I was working security that night. I saw Rollins go in. I checked the cameras later. But the footage was. He hesitated. It was edited, just like yours. Maya clenched her jaw. So you saved a copy. The man nodded. I didn't know what to do with it. I was scared. I tried to tell someone, one of the nurses. But she disappeared a week later. Maya inhaled sharply. Disappeared? Quit? Transferred? I don't know. One day she was here. The next day she wasn't. Maya reached for the flash drive. But the man hesitated. If they find out I gave this to you. He shook his head. You don't understand how deep this goes. Maya met his eyes. I understand more than you think. The man exhaled slowly, then placed the flash drive in her palm. Be careful, he said. Maya tightened her grip around the small device. You too. She turned to leave, her pulse still racing. But then, just as she reached her car, something felt off. The headlights of a car flickered in the distance. She glanced over her shoulder. The man was gone. Maya arrived at St. Vincent's just as the morning shift was starting. The hospital was coming alive. Nurses gathering in clusters with their coffee. Doctors rushing between departments. Patients shuffling through the hallways. It should have been a normal day. But as soon as she stepped inside, she felt it. The air was different. Conversations hushed as she passed. Eyes darted away when she made eye contact. Even Lisa, a nurse Maya had worked with for years, gave her a tight, uneasy smile before quickly turning back to her chart. Something was wrong. Maya quickened her pace, heading toward the staff lounge. She reached for her ID badge. But before she could scan it, a voice stopped her. Ms. Brooks. She turned. A security guard, a man named Roger Barnes, stood a few feet away. Beside him was Nancy Holloway, the hospital's HR director. The two of them together? That wasn't good. Nancy's face was a mask of professionalism. But there was something stiff about the way she held herself. We need you to come with us, Nancy said, her voice carefully measured. Maya's stomach clenched. What is this? She asked, though she already had a feeling. Nancy cleared her throat. You've been placed on indefinite leave. Effective immediately. Maya blinked. Excuse me? Roger shifted slightly, his hands resting on his belt. We'll need you to leave the premises, he said. We can escort you to your car. Maya ignored him. keeping her focus on Nancy. This is a joke, right? Maya's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Nancy hesitated. I assure you, it isn't. She pulled a manila envelope from the folder in her hands and handed it over. This outlines the terms of your suspension. It includes details on the ongoing internal investigation. Maya snatched it, flipping it open. The words blurred together for a second before snapping into focus. Unprofessional conduct, insubordination, violation of hospital policy. Maya exhaled slowly. You know this is retaliation, she said, lifting her gaze. Nancy pressed her lips together but said nothing. Maya scanned the lobby. More people were watching now. Technicians, nurses, even a few interns. They were pretending not to. But she could feel their eyes on her. They wanted a scene. She refused to give them one. With careful movements, she unclipped her badge from her lanyard and set it on the counter beside her. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the hospital. She didn't stop until she reached her car. The second the door shut behind her, she let out a shaky breath. Her phone buzzed. A text from Theo Carter. Theo was a civil rights attorney and an old friend. Someone Maya had reached out to when things first started unraveling. Call me, now. Maya immediately dialed. Theo picked up on the first ring. Maya, he said, his voice urgent, you need to check the news. Maya's grip on the phone tightened. What happened? Theo sighed. They're coming after you hard. Maya's fingers trembled as she opened her email. The first thing she saw was a headline from the Atlanta Ledger. Nurse Maya Brooks suspended amid allegations of misconduct. Her stomach turned. She clicked on the article. The report painted her as a reckless employee with a history of defying authority. It quoted anonymous hospital staff claiming she had a pattern of aggressive behavior and frequent clashes with hospital security. Maya swallowed hard and kept scrolling until she saw something that made her blood run cold. A photograph. It was an old image of her at what looked like a hospital charity event. The caption beneath it sent a chill down her spine. In 2017, Maya Brooks was reportedly involved in a misconduct case during a hospital shift. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She had never worked at St. Vincent's in 2017. Someone had fabricated the entire thing. This is a setup, Maya murmured. Theo's voice was firm. Of course it is. Maya inhaled sharply. How do I fight this? There was a pause. Then, Theo said, we start by finding out who planted that story. Maya clenched her jaw, her mind racing. She wasn't just up against Rollins anymore. She was up against an entire system designed to destroy her. Maya sat in the dimly lit coffee shop, her fingers wrapped around a cup of black coffee she hadn't taken a sip from. The cafe was quiet, the kind of place where people worked on laptops or read in silence. She had chosen it for that reason, somewhere discreet, somewhere she wouldn't be noticed. Across from her, Theo Carter leaned forward, lowering his voice. You sure about this? Maya didn't answer right away. She had spent the last 24 hours watching her name get dragged through the mud. Every news outlet that picked up the story had the same narrative: disruptive nurse, unprofessional conduct, a so-called history of insubordination. But the lie that made her blood boil the most was the 2017 accusation. Someone had gone out of their way to fabricate a past she didn't have. She wasn't just being fired. She was being erased. Maya met Theo's gaze. I can't wait for this to blow over, she said. They're not going to stop until they destroy me. So I'm going to make sure I destroy them first. Theo exhaled, rubbing his jaw. All right, he said. I know someone who might help. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts before turning the screen toward her. Elliot Price, investigative journalist. Maya read the name twice. Theo continued. He's covered police corruption before. Knows how to handle sensitive cases. But he won't print anything unless he has rock-solid proof. Maya nodded slowly. That was fine. She had proof. She took a breath, then said, set up the meeting. Later that evening, Maya found herself outside a diner on the outskirts of the city. The neon sign buzzed faintly overhead, casting a dull red glow onto the pavement. She spotted Theo first, standing near the entrance with a man she assumed was Elliot Price. He was in his early 40s, dressed in a dark jacket and jeans. There was something sharp about him. The way his eyes scanned the parking lot before he even acknowledged her. Maya approached, shaking his hand. I've read your work, she said. Elliot gave a small nod. Hope it didn't put you to sleep. Theo chuckled. Trust me, nothing about this situation is boring. They went inside and slid into a booth at the back. Maya didn't waste time. She pulled out the flash drive and placed it on the table. Elliot raised an eyebrow. What's on it? Maya exhaled. A video. Rollins in the trauma room. A patient who never made it out. Elliot's expression didn't change, but she saw the way his fingers twitched slightly. Let me guess, he said. The official record says he died of his injuries? Maya nodded. The footage tells a different story. Elliot picked up the flash drive, turning it between his fingers. I'll need to verify it. Of course, Maya said, but there's more. I want to find the family of that patient. Elliot frowned. You think they know something? I think they were threatened into silence, she said. Elliot studied her for a long moment, then leaned back in his seat. All right, he said. I'll see what I can find. Maya glanced at Theo, who gave her a reassuring nod. For the first time in days, she felt like she wasn't just reacting, she was taking control. The next morning, Maya and Elliot drove to a quiet neighborhood on the south side of the city. The house they were looking for was small, with faded paint and an overgrown lawn. Maya knocked on the door. A woman in her 50s answered, her eyes wary. Can I help you? Maya hesitated. Mrs. Gaines? The door started to close. Please, Maya said quickly. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here about your son. The woman froze. Elliot stepped forward. We know what happened at St. Vincent's, he said. We know about Rollins. Mrs. Gaines' breath hitched. She looked past them, scanning the street. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, you need to leave. Maya's chest tightened. If you talk to us, we can expose them. Mrs. Gaines' eyes filled with something. Fear. Grief. Maybe both. You don't understand, she said. They already warned me once. Maya swallowed hard. Before she could say anything else, the door shut. Elliot exhaled. That went well. Maya clenched her jaw. We're not giving up. Elliot gave her a look. Be careful, Brooks. People who push too hard tend to disappear. Maya didn't flinch. Then I'll make sure I'm too loud to ignore. That night, Maya sat in her car, refreshing the news. She was waiting for Elliot's first article to go live. The moment it did, everything would change. But before she could check again, a notification popped up. Breaking news. She clicked on it, and her stomach dropped. Journalist Elliot Price attacked outside his home. Condition unknown. Maya's hands started to shake. Maya's hands tightened around the steering wheel as she pulled into a parking lot a few blocks away from the Atlanta Police Department. She knew better than to park directly in front of the station. If Rollins or anyone connected to him saw her coming, she'd never get the information she needed. The city felt different tonight. The air was thick, heavy with an unease she couldn't shake. Maybe it was just paranoia creeping in. Or maybe she was finally seeing things for what they really were. Elliot Price was lying in a hospital bed, barely clinging to life, because he had dared to expose the truth. Jordan Tate, the only other person who had proof, was suddenly unreachable. And now, Maya was about to step into the lion's den. She took a deep breath, pulled her hood up, and walked toward the police station's side entrance. Inside, the station was buzzing with the usual activity, officers typing reports, phones ringing, the faint murmur of conversations. Maya kept her head down as she weaved through the crowded room, heading straight for the records department. The woman at the front desk barely looked up. Can I help you? Maya placed a folded piece of paper on the counter. I'm here for a records request. Case number 42897. The woman sighed, flipping through a stack of folders before glancing at her screen. That's an internal investigation file, she said. You'll need special clearance. Maya leaned in slightly. I have it. The woman hesitated, then nodded toward a side door. Room 203. You've got 10 minutes. Maya didn't wait. She pushed through the door and found herself in a dimly lit archive room. Rows of cabinets stretched from floor to ceiling. The scent of old paper filled the air. She scanned the labels until she found the section marked Internal Affairs. Her fingers trailed over the files until she saw it. Rollins, Jake. She pulled the folder out and flipped it open. At first glance, It was nothing out of the ordinary. Routine disciplinary actions, minor infractions. But then, as she turned the pages, something caught her eye. An incident from 5 years ago. Excessive force complaint. A suspect had been beaten during an arrest. Rollins had claimed self-defense, and the case had been closed. But the document had been altered. Maya traced her fingers over the print. Some sections had been redacted, entire paragraphs missing, and at the bottom of the page, a signature, Captain Warren Delacroix. Maya's breath caught. She knew that name. Delacroix wasn't just some random officer. He was one of the highest-ranking officials in the department. And if his name was on this file, it meant Rollins wasn't acting alone. Someone powerful had been protecting him for years. Maya pulled out her phone and snapped a picture of the page. She didn't hear the footsteps until it was too late. A shadow fell over her. She turned just as a heavy hand clamped down on her wrist. "What do you think you're doing, Brooks?" Rollins. His grip was crushing, his fingers digging into her skin as he yanked the file from her hands. "You just can't let things go, can you?" His voice was low, almost amused. "I warned you." Maya wrenched her arm free. Stepping back. "You're scared," she said. "That's why you're here." Rollins laughed. "Scared?" He leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "You really think some old file is going to bring me down?" Maya didn't flinch. "It's not just a file," she said. "It's a pattern. And now I have proof." His jaw tightened. For the first time, she saw something flicker across his face, something that looked a lot like doubt. He shoved the file back into the cabinet and slammed it shut. "You should walk away while you still can." Maya held his gaze. "That's not going to happen." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Rollins smirked. "Your choice." He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Maya exhaled shakily, tucking her phone into her pocket. She had what she needed. But she wasn't safe. Not even close. Maya's apartment was dark when she pulled into the driveway. Too dark. She hesitated before stepping out of the car, her pulse quickening. The front door was slightly ajar. She hadn't left it that way. Her hands shook as she reached for the doorknob and pushed it open. The living room was wrecked. Drawers pulled out, papers scattered across the floor, furniture overturned. It wasn't a robbery. Whoever did this hadn't taken anything valuable. They had been looking for something. Maya's heart pounded as she stepped forward. Then she saw it. On the coffee table, a single sheet of paper. A note, scrawled in messy handwriting. "Stop before it's too late." Maya's stomach twisted. They had been here, and they wanted her to know it. Maya sat behind the wheel of her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The interior of the vehicle was dark, the only light coming from a flickering street lamp overhead. She forced herself to take slow, steady breaths. Her apartment was no longer safe. The mess inside wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. They weren't trying to scare her anymore. They were making it clear that she was next. She pulled out her phone and dialed Theo Carter. He picked up on the first ring. "Maya?" His voice was tense. "I need to meet you," she said. "Now." Theo didn't hesitate. "My office. 20 minutes. She ended the call, started the car, and pulled away from the curb without looking back. Theo's office was a small, cluttered space in a nondescript building downtown. Stacks of legal files covered the desk, and an old coffee maker sputtered in the corner. Maya shut the door behind her and locked it. Theo studied her face. "You look like hell." Maya exhaled sharply. "That's because I just walked into my apartment and found it trashed." Theo's jaw tightened. "They're getting bolder. They're getting desperate." Maya corrected. "Elliot was attacked. Jordan Tate disappeared. And now they've made it clear I'm next." Theo ran a hand over his face. "Maya, listen to me. You need to get out of town." She shook her head. "No. Maya, if I leave, they win." She interrupted. "Everything we've found, everything we've worked for, it'll all disappear." Theo sighed, leaning back in his chair. "At least lay low for a while. We can handle the legal battle from here." Maya crossed her arms. "Legal battles take months, maybe years. By then, Rollins and his people will have erased every trace of what they've done." Theo didn't argue. He knew she was right. Instead, he pulled open a drawer and slid a burner phone across the desk. "Take this," he said. Your phone is probably compromised. Maya picked it up, her stomach twisting. She hadn't even thought about that. Theo continued, stay off social media. Don't use your credit cards. And whatever you do, don't go anywhere alone. Maya swallowed hard but nodded. Then she picked up her bag. I need to find Jordan Tate. Theo's brow furrowed. Maya, I'll be careful, she said. She didn't wait for his response. Jordan Tate's last known address was a rundown apartment building on the east side of the city. Maya parked a block away and walked the rest of the way on foot. Keeping her head down, the building was eerily quiet. No lights in the windows. No sounds from inside. She knocked once, twice. No answer. Maya pressed her ear against the door. Silence. Something wasn't right. She tried the handle. It turned easily. Her pulse quickened as she stepped inside. The apartment was empty. Not just vacant, stripped clean. No furniture. No personal belongings. Nothing. As if no one had ever lived there. A chill ran down her spine. Jordan Tate hadn't just left. They had been erased. Maya turned back toward the hallway. Her instincts screaming at her to get out. That's when she saw it. A car parked across the street. The engine was running. And someone was inside, watching her. Maya didn't wait. She hurried down the stairs, moving quickly toward the sidewalk. The car pulled forward. She forced herself to stay calm, walking briskly toward the parking lot. Her own car was only a few yards away. She reached into her bag, fumbling for her keys. Footsteps behind her. A hand clamped over her mouth. Panic surged through her as she was yanked backward, dragged into the darkness of a nearby alley. Her muffled scream went unheard. Maya's head throbbed as she blinked through the darkness. The metallic scent of old rust filled her nose, mixing with the acrid stench of gasoline. The floor beneath her vibrated with the steady hum of an engine. And the sharp bite of plastic zip ties dug into her wrists. She was in the back of a moving vehicle. Her breathing was shallow as she tried to piece together what had happened. The last thing she remembered was the firm grip dragging her into the alley. The rough cloth pressed against her mouth. The brief struggle before everything faded into a blur of adrenaline and panic. Now, she was here, wherever here was. The van hit a pothole, sending her body jerking to the side. She inhaled sharply, shifting to get a better look around. The only light came from a crack between the rear doors, barely illuminating the empty cargo space. She wasn't alone. A figure sat on a bench against the wall, half hidden in the shadows. Maya forced herself to stay still, listening. The driver up front said nothing. Whoever had taken her wasn't interested in conversation. That was a bad sign. A very bad sign. She glanced around the cargo floor. Nothing useful, just dust and grime and... Her pulse jumped. A glint of silver near the wheel well. A knife. Small, barely more than a box cutter. But it was something. Maya shifted her weight, inching toward it without making a sound. The figure across from her stirred. Don't, the voice murmured. Male, low, almost detached. Maya froze. The figure leaned forward, and for the first time, she could make out his features. He was young, mid-20s, maybe, with a bruised cheek and dried blood at his temple. His wrists were bound like hers, zip ties digging deep into his skin. She hadn't been the only one taken. Who are you? She whispered. The man shook his head. Doesn't matter. Maya narrowed her eyes. Did Rollins send you? The man exhaled sharply, almost a laugh. If Rollins wanted you dead, you wouldn't be sitting here. That didn't exactly put her at ease. The van made another sharp turn, sending her sliding across the floor. Her fingertips brushed the knife, and she curled her hand around it, slipping it up the sleeve of her jacket. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. She didn't know how much time she had. Maya counted every turn, every stop, memorizing the route as best as she could. They had been driving for at least 40 minutes, moving further and further away from the city. That meant one thing. If she didn't get out now, she wouldn't be coming back. The man across from her shifted again, testing his restraints. His expression was unreadable, but there was something calculating in his gaze. He was waiting for something. Maya wasn't about to wait with him. She took a slow breath, then moved. In one swift motion, she flicked the knife from her sleeve and began sawing at the plastic binding her wrists. The sharp edge dug into her skin, But she didn't stop. The man raised an eyebrow. You sure that's a good idea? Maya ignored him. The van hit another bump, and the ties snapped. She didn't hesitate. Maya lunged forward, slamming her shoulder into the rear doors. The metal groaned, but didn't budge. She cursed under her breath. The man sighed. You're really doing this now? Maya gritted her teeth. You got a better idea? His lips curled into something almost like amusement. Actually, yeah. Before she could respond, he kicked out, hard. The doors burst open. Cold air rushed inside, yanking Maya's breath from her lungs. The van was still moving, tires skidding against gravel. The man twisted his body, his tied hands gripping the doorframe. Ladies first. Maya didn't need to be told twice. She jumped. The impact was brutal. Her body hit the ground, rolling across dirt and dead leaves. Her lungs seized as she tumbled, arms shielding her face from the worst of it. Then, silence. Just the rustling trees, the distant hum of the van speeding away. Maya groaned, pushing herself up onto her elbows. Her ribs ached, her knees scraped raw, but she was alive. She turned, expecting to see the man beside her. But he was gone. Maya didn't know how long she sat there, staring into the darkness of the forest. Then, the realization hit her. She reached into her pocket, fingers fumbling for her phone. The screen lit up, and then, it didn't. It went black. She tried again. Nothing. Her stomach dropped. She swiped through her apps, searching for her saved messages. Her photos, her call logs. Gone. Everything was gone. Her files, her contacts, every piece of evidence she had collected. Someone had wiped her phone clean. Maya clenched her jaw, her breath coming faster. They had taken everything from her. And now, she was alone. Maya sat in the dark corner of an abandoned rest stop, knees drawn to her chest, staring at the cracked screen of her phone. The battery was low, but that wasn't the problem. The real problem was that everything was gone. Every message, every email, every saved file. Erased. She had checked 3 times, her fingers growing more frantic each time she scrolled. Photos? Gone. Contacts? Gone. The video from the hospital? The internal files on Rollins? Everything. Her hands shook as she tried calling Theo Carter. The line rang once, then went straight to voicemail. She tried again. Nothing. Maya squeezed her eyes shut, pressing the phone against her forehead. Had they gotten to him too? Was he even safe? She had no way of knowing. The fluorescent light above flickered weakly, buzzing against the silence. The rest stop had been abandoned for years. An empty parking lot. A vending machine with nothing but dust inside. A few broken payphones that hadn't worked in a decade. She had found it by accident while running through the woods, desperate for a place to think. Now, she wasn't sure if she should even be stopping. Every second she wasn't moving was a second closer to being found. Maya forced herself to breathe. She needed to think, needed a plan. Rollins hadn't just wanted her dead, he wanted her erased. And whoever was pulling the strings with him had the power to do it. She needed to get back to the city. She needed to find Theo. And most importantly, she needed to find a way to fight back. Maya walked for miles before she found a truck stop just outside Atlanta. She kept her hood up, head low, moving past rows of parked semis until she found the convenience store attached to the station. Inside, a battered old television was mounted above the counter, playing a local news segment. She stopped cold. Her own face was staring back at her. The news anchor's voice was calm, detached, like she was reading the weather. Maya Brooks, a former nurse at St. Vincent's Hospital, is currently wanted by authorities for obstruction of justice and interfering with an active police investigation. According to sources, Brooks, who was recently suspended, may be in possession of classified medical records and is considered a person of interest. Maya's blood turned to ice. The headline at the bottom of the screen confirmed it. Maya Brooks. Wanted. They hadn't just erased her, they had flipped the entire story. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was the criminal. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she backed away from the screen, her heart pounding against her ribs. The cashier at the counter, a heavy-set man in his 50s, glanced at her suspiciously. She turned before he could get a better look. Maya walked out of the store and into the night, her hands shaking, They had taken everything from her. And now, they were coming for what was left. Maya ran. The cold night air stung her lungs as she weaved through the empty streets. Her hood pulled low, her hands shoved deep into her pockets to hide the trembling. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on her like an iron vice. She was wanted. Her name was on every news station. Her face was plastered across every screen. The system that had once protected her as a nurse now hunted her as a fugitive. She turned a corner and slowed her pace, forcing herself to breathe, think. Theo was unreachable. Jordan Tate had vanished. Elliot Price was in the hospital. She had no phone, no money, no safe place to go. The city was no longer an option. Every alley, every street, every familiar landmark had become a trap. She needed to disappear, and she knew exactly where to go. The small church sat on the edge of town, nestled between two abandoned buildings. St. Mark's had never been a grand place, just an old brick structure with a fading white cross above the door. But to Maya, it was a memory. She had spent summers here as a teenager, volunteering at food drives, sitting in the back pew when she had nowhere else to go. It wasn't just a church. It was a sanctuary. She hesitated at the entrance, glancing over her shoulder. No headlights, no sirens, just the eerie silence of the night. Maya pushed the heavy door open and slipped inside. The air smelled of candle wax and aged wood. Dim light flickered from the altar, casting shadows across the empty pews. And then she saw him. Father William Abbott. He was older than she remembered. His once dark hair now completely gray. His frame thinner but still standing tall in his priest's robes. He was placing hymn books on the altar when he looked up, his expression shifting from surprise to something softer. Maya Brooks. His voice was calm, steady, like the world hadn't just turned her into a fugitive. Maya swallowed hard. I need help. Father Abbott set the books down and gestured toward a pew. Come, sit. Maya hesitated only a second before moving toward him. Her legs felt unsteady, her body exhausted from the past 48 hours of running. She sat. The priest studied her for a long moment, then sighed. I saw the news. Maya tensed. But I also know you, he continued, and I know the difference between truth and lies. Her throat tightened. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear those words. Father Abbott took a seat beside her. Tell me what happened. Maya exhaled shakily. I don't know where to start. Then start at the beginning. So she did. She told him everything. About Rollins. About the hospital. About the erased files. About the attack on Elliot Price. She told him how they had turned her into the villain. How they had taken everything from her. And when she was done, Father Abbott didn't speak right away. Then he said, they want you to feel alone. Maya looked up. That's how they win. He continued. They make you believe there's no one left to fight for you. But you're not alone. Maya. Her eyes stung. Father Abbott stood. You can stay here for the night. But after that, we need to find a way to get you out of the city. Maya nodded slowly. She didn't like the idea of running. But right now, survival was the only thing that mattered. Father Abbott placed a gentle hand on her shoulder before walking toward the back of the church. Rest, child. Maya leaned back against the wooden pew, closing her eyes for just a moment. Then, a sound. A car door slamming. Maya's eyes snapped open. She turned her head toward the stained glass window, her heart pounding. 2 police cruisers had pulled up outside. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched shadows move past the windows. The crunch of boots on gravel growing louder. The front door creaked. Someone was coming inside. Maya pressed herself deeper into the shadows, her pulse hammering. She had seconds to decide. Run, or surrender. Maya's breath was steady, but her heart pounded like a war drum. She crouched behind the pews, watching through the stained glass window as the flashing red and blue lights painted the night outside. 2 police cruisers, maybe more waiting nearby. They had found her. Father Abbott stood near the altar, gripping the edge of the wooden podium as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. He wasn't a man built for deception, but his voice remained calm as he spoke to the officers outside the church doors. She's not here, he said, his words measured, deliberate. You're wasting your time. Maya knew the lie wouldn't hold for long. She could feel it, the weight of inevitability pressing down on her. She had spent so much time running, From the system. From the lies. From the fear that had followed her since the moment she refused to back down. But she couldn't run anymore. Not if she wanted to win. She had one move left. Maya took a slow breath and reached into her pocket. Fingers wrapping around the burner phone Theo had given her. It was still there, still working. She pressed a button and dialed. Lisa Moreno's voice was tight when he answered. Maya? She didn't waste time. I need you to go live. Right now. There was a pause. A slight hesitation. Then, are you sure? They're coming for me, she said. I need the world to see what they've done. She could hear him moving. Could picture him scrambling to set up his equipment. What do you have? Maya gritted her teeth. I don't have the original files. She admitted. But there's something else. Jordan Tate showed me a video. One that proves Rollins didn't just target me. He's done this before. Lisa Moreno's voice sharpened. Do you have it? No. Silence. Maya forced herself to keep going. But I know where to find it. Lisa Moreno exhaled. And you want me to put this out there with no proof? Maya's fingers curled into a fist. That's why I need you to go live. She said, if I don't make it out of here, people need to know where to look. A beat of silence. Then, okay. She ended the call just as Father Abbott turned back toward her. His expression was grim. They're coming in, he whispered. Maya squared her shoulders. It was time. She stepped out from behind the pews just as the church doors swung open. 2 officers entered first, weapons drawn. And then, Rollins. He walked in slow, deliberate steps, like a hunter closing in on wounded prey. For the first time, Maya could see it in his face. The exhaustion, the frustration. She hadn't just survived, she had become a problem. Maya Brooks, he said, on your knees, hands behind your head. Maya didn't move. Rollins tilted his head. You're out of options. Maya met his gaze. No, she said, I'm not. Then, her phone vibrated. A single message flashed across the screen. There's another way. Come find me. I have proof. She read it twice. Then, before she could stop herself, she looked back up, straight into Rollins' eyes. And she smiled. Maya moved quickly through the church's narrow back hallways. Her breath controlled but her mind racing. Father Abbott had shown her a hidden exit. A side door behind the vestry that led to a small garden, which opened to an alleyway. If she could slip out unnoticed, she had a chance. Outside, the night air was thick with humidity. The streets were quiet, but she knew better than to assume she was alone. The police weren't careless. If they had tracked her here, they would have someone watching every possible escape route. She needed to be faster, smarter. The phone in her pocket buzzed again. Come alone. No police. No tricks. She clenched her jaw. If this was real, it was her best chance at exposing Rollins and whoever else was pulling the strings. If it was a trap, she wouldn't live long enough to regret it. She didn't have a choice. Maya ducked into the shadows and disappeared into the night. The location in the message led her to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place where bad things happened, where people went in and never came out. Her fingers curled into fists as she stepped inside. The air smelled of dust and rusted metal. A single hanging light flickered above, casting long shadows against the cracked concrete floor. Then she saw him. Jordan Tate, the witness who had vanished. He looked thinner, his clothes wrinkled, dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. But he was alive, and in his hands, a phone. Maya's heart pounded. You have it, she whispered. Jordan Tate nodded. The full footage, the one they thought they erased. Hope surged in Maya's chest. This was it, the proof she needed, the truth that could finally bring Rollins down. She reached forward. A gunshot shattered the silence. Jordan Tate jerked. His eyes widened, his body convulsing as blood bloomed across his chest. Maya barely had time to react before he crumpled to the ground. Her breath caught in her throat. Then she heard it, footsteps behind her. She turned and saw Theo Carter, her closest ally, the man who had helped her since the beginning, holding a gun, standing next to Rollins. Maya's entire body went cold. Theo, her voice barely made a sound. His expression was unreadable. I told you to leave town. Maya. She stumbled back, her mind trying to catch up, trying to understand. Rollins smiled. She's a fighter. I'll give her that. But even fighters don't win when they don't know who their real enemies are. Maya's pulse roared in her ears. Theo had never been on her side. And now, she was trapped. Maya's breath was shallow, her mind racing as she locked eyes with Theo, the man she had trusted, the man who had guided her through every step of this nightmare. And now, the man standing beside Rollins, gun still warm in his hand after shooting Jordan Tate. She wanted to ask why. She wanted to scream, but there was no time for that. Rollins exhaled slowly, shaking his head. You just don't know when to quit, do you? He took a step forward, his boots echoing in the vast emptiness of the warehouse. You could have walked away, Maya. I gave you chances. Hell, I tried to make it easy for you. But no, he chuckled, the sound dry and humorless. You had to play hero. Maya's fingers twitched. She wasn't armed. She wasn't even sure she could run. But she wasn't about to die here. Not after everything. She forced her voice to stay even. Is that what you tell yourself? That you were merciful? Rollins smirked. You think you're special? You think this is about you? He gestured around the room. People like me. We're the reason this city runs. You're just another name on a list of nobodies who thought they could change the system. Theo remained silent. His grip on the gun didn't falter. But there was something unreadable in his expression. Maya clenched her jaw. Why? She asked, her voice quieter now. Not to Rollins, to Theo. He hesitated. Rollins laughed. Oh, come on. You really thought he was on your side? He clapped Theo on the shoulder. You were always so damn predictable. Always running to him for help. Always thinking he actually gave a damn. Maya saw it then. Just for a fraction of a second. Something flicker across Theo's face. Guilt. Rollins either didn't notice or didn't care. He turned back to her. You know what's funny? You never even had a chance. He raised his gun. And now, you never will. Maya braced herself. And then, a sound. A buzz. A vibration from Theo's pocket. Rollins frowned, glancing toward him. What the hell is that? Theo didn't answer. He just pulled out his phone, eyes scanning the screen. And then, slowly, he lifted his head. Maya's heart pounded. Because she knew exactly what had just happened. Jordan Tate had been shot. But they weren't stupid. They had sent the video somewhere safe before coming here. Somewhere it could be unleashed if anything happened to them. And now, it was out. Theo turned the screen toward Rollins. The video was playing. Rollins' face went pale. No. Maya took a step forward. Yes. Rollins lunged. But before he could pull the trigger, the entire warehouse lit up in red and blue. Headlights flooded through the broken windows. Engines roared outside. Then, voices. Drop your weapons. Hands in the air. Maya's knees almost buckled. It wasn't Rollins' people. It wasn't his corrupt officers. It was them. The ones even he couldn't control. FBI. Rollins turned, panic flashing in his eyes. Theo. Theo didn't move. He didn't say a word. He just let the gun slip from his fingers. And then, Rollins ran. It didn't matter. Because the moment he reached the door, federal agents swarmed inside, guns raised, orders shouted, and Rollins, the man who had spent years pulling the strings, controlling the system, deciding who lived and who disappeared, was finally caught in his own trap. Maya didn't watch as they tackled him to the ground. Didn't care about the sound of cuffs snapping shut. She just exhaled. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she knew she had won. The courthouse was eerily quiet. Maya sat in the back of the room, watching as Rollins was led inside, his wrists cuffed, his expression unreadable. The once arrogant officer now wore a standard orange jumpsuit, but there was no fear in his eyes. That unsettled her. The judge read out the charges: civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, falsification of reports, and conspiracy. The prosecution laid out the evidence, the video, the testimonies, the documents proving Rollins' pattern of abuse. It was everything Maya had fought for. And yet, as she listened, she felt nothing. There was no victory in this. Not really. The trial lasted weeks. The public outrage was immense. News outlets dissected every detail. Panel discussions debated systemic corruption. Protests erupted in the city. Maya watched it all from a distance. She wasn't a nurse anymore. St. Vincent had officially terminated her contract, citing violations of ethical conduct. Not that it mattered. She knew she'd never work in a hospital again, not after this. She wasn't sure she wanted to. Instead, she sat in coffee shops, reading headlines that should have felt like justice. Officer Rollins convicted of civil rights violations. Federal investigation launched into department corruption. Atlanta mayor promises law enforcement reform. But then, buried at the bottom of one article, newly appointed Sergeant Daniel Graves vows to restore order to police department. Maya frowned. She clicked the article, scanning quickly. Sergeant Graves had been handpicked to replace Rollins. He had given a press conference the day before, promising swift disciplinary action for officers who stepped out of line. But something about his wording felt familiar. Like she'd heard it before. Like nothing had changed. The day of Rollins' sentencing, Maya stood outside the courthouse, watching the reporters swarm. Cameras flashed, microphones hovered, questions were thrown like grenades. "How do you feel about today's verdict?" one journalist asked. Maya turned, recognizing Lisa Moreno, the journalist who had risked everything to expose the truth. She hesitated, then said, "It's a start." Lisa Moreno raised an eyebrow. "Just a start?" Maya exhaled. Rollins was a symptom, not the disease. The journalist nodded. "Then what's next?" Maya didn't answer, because she wasn't sure yet. As she walked away from the courthouse, she noticed a police cruiser parked across the street. A man sat in the driver's seat. Sergeant Daniel Graves. He was watching her. Their eyes met for just a second. He didn't smirk. He didn't nod. He just stared. And Maya understood the message. They were still here. They were always here. Maya clenched her fists, inhaled deeply, and kept walking. She wasn't done yet. The fight for justice doesn't end with one conviction. It doesn't stop because one corrupt cop is behind bars. The system doesn't break that easily. Maya Brooks exposed the truth. But at what cost? She lost everything: her career, her peace, even the belief that justice was guaranteed. And yet, she didn't back down. Because the real battle isn't just about one person, it's about all of us. So here's the question. If the system is designed to protect itself, who will hold it accountable? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you want more stories that challenge the truth, uncover corruption, and shine a light where others won't, subscribe to Covert Truths. The fight isn't over.